Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War news update, second part thereof for the 15th of October 2024, if you ignore my breaking news update earlier. Right, we're going to start with the subject of my breaking news update, which is fascinating how North Korea, Iran, China simply helped Russia. No big events for decisions to be made. No big events required for decisions to be made. No big media announcements. Just action. Meanwhile, Ukraine still hasn't received the Patriot systems promised in July by allies. Shameful, disgusting, infuriating. I believe they have actually got the Romanian one, but the general point is salient that, you know, the North Koreans and Iranians get on and just provide Russia with whatever they want. Russia say jump, these guys say how high, and they get on and do that. Sign bilateral agreements. And then send troops, as we are hearing North Korea doing, send troops to Russia and to Ukraine to help Russia. And meanwhile, we dither about and don't really act decisively enough and tie Ukraine's hands behind their backs. It's really, really infuriating. The EU is to extend the Ukrainian military training, the training mission for 2 more years, according to the head of EU Diplomatic Service, Joseph Borrell. Glad that he is still strongly behind Ukraine there. And the EU is pivoting, apparently, to invest in Ukraine's defence industry. Now, I don't understand this. Unless the only reason this could make sense is if the money spent is just goes a lot further, so it's cheaper to do this. So the EU is pivoting to invest in Ukraine's defence industry due to challenges in supplying necessary weapons and ammo, per the Washington Post. A European diplomat noted, quote, "Europe can't produce what Ukraine needs, so the simplest solution is for Ukrainians to do it themselves. If they have the materials and funds, they can do it much faster." I don't know why this would be the case, because surely if this is a case of money being spent to get a product, assuming both sides have the facilities in place, then surely you'd prefer to spend that money inside Europe as the EU. Now, if they don't have, the only reason you'd spend that money in Ukraine is if Ukraine have the facilities to manufacture things that Europe doesn't. And so therefore, in order to make that stuff in Europe, you have to build the facilities to do so, which adds huge costs to the whole process, and it becomes more expensive. But there are already these facilities. Yes, you need to ramp up production, but I don't understand why Europe has not been able to react fast enough to Ukraine's needs, because this is surely an economic stimulus for Europe. And surely there'll be companies that are willing for this to take place in Europe, unless those companies like, actually, even though there's a risk associated with this, if we build it underground, we can get cheaper labour in Ukraine, or cheaper taxes or something. I don't quite understand this. There's something weird going on here, that Europe would be giving up on trying to invest inside Europe, the EU, give up on investing inside Europe for the in favour of doing it in Ukraine, sorry. Anyway, on that kind of note, ramping up production, what's his name, Doug Bush, who is Army Acquisition Chief in USA, has acknowledged that the Americans, have unfortunately slipped on the 155mm production ramp up. So they were doing really, really well at this. It started at sort of 14,000, went up to, per month. 155mm shells went up to 28,000. They moved it further. Now 40,000 per month is now, but right now, so 40,000 per month is where they're at the moment, which has moved only somewhat more slowly on from the sort of 30,000 a month it was previously, but they're only going to achieve 55,000 per month by the end of this year. It was supposed to be 70,000 by the end of this year, and then 80,000 per month was what they were aiming for. And this infographic, Colby Badbois, I presume he's produced, maybe he hasn't, but he's got that from somewhere. He sort of explains this, and you can see it's really plateaued there. It's going to be a lot to do with supplementals. Now, we know that the rest of the USAI, which was the this part of the supplemental where they could spend that on ordering. So this is, you would think this would come from USAI. So I think they would have drawn from their stocks already, or the presidential drawdown. Anyway, either way, because it could come from presidential drawdown, they can continue drawing from their stocks and then replenish them through the other part, the supplemental, where they then replace what has been taken from presidential drawdown. Anyway, point being is that they have plateaued here, and that is a real shame. There's also the claim, have I got it here? Yeah, so this person says Zelensky must hate Biden so much. Ukraine is getting pummeled by 300 ballistic missiles a month, and we're putting a freaking THAAD battery in Israel. So there's also the idea that some of the 155mm ammunition might also be going to Israel. I can't definitively say that, but I did see someone making a claim that actually some of this has to do with Israel, as in this stuff finding its way or not to Ukraine is being affected by Israel and the issues there. And of course, that's all pretty controversial for a whole number of reasons. And then, yeah, we hear that a THAAD. So basically the THAAD is an anti-ballistic missile system that operates at really high levels. Is it something like 140, 150 kilometers up, into the atmosphere? And that's where it takes down the missiles. But things like Iskander-Ms, I think, operate very high, but up to 140 kilometers. So THAAD wouldn't be so useful. Lots of people are calling on these to be used in Ukraine, but actually they're less useful for Ukraine. But evidently they must be useful for Israel. So I don't know what missiles the Iranians are using, but evidently ones that go higher. But it is kind of odd that the US is providing with this really, one would think, top level piece of kit for the Israelis, but there's still a lack of really forthright support for Ukraine at the moment. It's as if Ukraine, because it's so politically divisive, is just being dropped because the elections are taking place. I don't know. The Greek defense minister, I thought this was interesting, Greek defense minister Nikos Dendias has stated that the repair or refurbishment costs to bring the M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles that Greece could receive via the USA's excess defense article program could be as high as €8 million per vehicle. It's the idea that through the EDA, the Greeks could receive a whole bunch of infantry fighting vehicles. I don't know if this is to do with their sending of Soviet era stuff to Ukraine or what, but this is interesting just for how much it costs and for potentially how many of those Bradleys, thousands of Bradleys sitting out in the desert, are actually usable. Right, so Greece has been trying to get Bradleys via the EDA program for a while now, with a delegation having travelled to Camp Shelby in Mississippi to select 62 potential candidate vehicles. However, they came to the conclusion that none of those vehicles were in any way close to being operational, and that the costs to refurbish them were prohibitive. BAE Systems had also, on its own accord, offered to sell 102 Bradleys to Greece, but these were in no better state. So it appears that there's an awful lot of Bradleys kicking about, but they are just not in a workable condition. And I wonder how that affects Ukraine. I wonder if Ukraine might have received more Bradleys had there been more in better condition. How much is it costing to actually do up these Bradleys and get them out to Ukraine in a usable state? Interesting. And that, what can we learn anything from Greece's experience there with regard to Ukraine? I don't know. Now, if you remember, well, let's okay, rewind. Do you guys, hopefully you remember this. This is the, oh my goodness, it's got a really long acronym. It's something like, here it says AIAMDSOS. I think you can throw in IBCS as well. This is a whole sort of engagement system whereby you are putting together in a single centrally controllable network your radars and your missile launchers and your command and control centers, That's radars on the ground, radars in the air, space, Link 16 connecting planes to the system, so on and so forth. All of these different systems are then connected together in one central place, and it's kind of plug and play. And indeed, so basically the rumor was that one of these systems went to Ukraine quite early on, or certainly well over sort of a year and a half ago. I was talking about this. Now, this is a really quite brand new thing for the Americans, and it was quite a big coup for Ukraine to get this system from the Americans, since it's like hot off R&D. It was, I believe, the first working system kind of thing went to Ukraine. Now, there's been an implicit recognition that did actually happen, as Colby Bedwell points out, at USA 2024 Program Executive Office, the USA 2024. So that's some kind of conference, association of the United States Army. There you go. The Program Executive Officer, Missiles and Space, Major General Frank Lozano, shares a story about Ukrainian Patriot crews asking him for something to help him integrate all of their air defense systems. The Army went on to draw down an IBCS EOC to help them with that. So what John Ridge says on top of that is PEOM&S finally directly confirming an IBCS engagement operations center was transferred to Ukraine in early 2023. The transfer was initially disclosed in an April 2023 reprogramming action to align funds for a replacement EOC, which myself and others noted at the time. So it's implicit, because they didn't say we sent this thing, but it's like they asked us for something that does this and we helped them with that. And from that you draw this conclusion that, yeah, they did get this system, and that is really quite vital. I guess after this war is over, we'll find out how useful, successful systems like this were, and things that were given to Ukraine. And I'm fascinated in how much they rely or not on US and French and British satellite imagery, and your ISR capabilities, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities from things like satellites. I'm sure that certainly was an asymmetry there for the Ukrainians to gain an advantage, and I think the Chinese may be now closing that gap with the Russians. Right, Ukraine has delivered 1 million state-funding drones to the front line, according to Zelensky. He emphasized the intention to further increase these supplies with the primary goal of using technological advancements. There is a claim that they're going to get between 3 and 4 million produced in the next year. Now, Russia is luring men from the most impoverished corners of the planet to become worm food in Ukraine, says G in Kiev, typically rhetorically. So this is a TikTok story with, it looks like a journalist going to Nepal to find a distraught mother who has lost her son to the Russians. I think he may be in a POW at the moment in some kind of Ukrainian prison. But yeah, from Kathmandu to Ukraine, lured into the army, fights on behalf of Russia. How many of these people? There were some claims that there were 14 to 15,000 Nepalese fighters, but I don't know if that was not just a massive over-exaggeration, but there certainly are a number of them. There are a fairly significant number of them by all accounts. So that's also replicated in other countries. Sri Lankans we've seen, Indians we've seen, Cape Verde Islands, places in Africa, I believe, as well. So here you go, and that's the CBC News foreign correspondent going to speak to the mother of one of those Nepali soldiers. Anyway, we have here, this is what I did my breaking news update on, a claim from Liga.net, so a Ukrainian news source, whereby they have spoken to someone supposedly in the know that has claimed that Russia's forming a battalion of North Korean citizens based on a Buryat brigade. A battalion would be created within the 11th Separate Air Assault Brigade with an estimated 3,000 personnel. It's speculated that this unit may be deployed for combat missions near Sudzha in the Kursk region. And that's obviously incredibly serious. This is stepping over a very large and throbbing red line. And this should, I think, invoke a reaction from the West and from NATO, from allies of Ukraine. I hope it does, because this is Russia very much escalating, I would say, very clearly escalating. And we've seen a definite trajectory going on here where the North Koreans have provided 13,000 odd cargo sort of marine containers of artillery ammunition to Russia, so that the Russians are now using 50% of their artillery ammunition is now North Korean. Then we also know that they're using KN-23 ballistic missiles from North Korea as well. North Koreans, says the Guardian, deployed alongside Russian troops in Ukraine, and we then saw 6 to support launch assistance for the KN-23 missiles there. We know that 6 officers died in a strike in, I think, was it Luhansk or Donetsk, where obviously North Koreans are within Ukraine, in the occupied territories of Ukraine, helping out the Russians in some way. And now we hear that there are, well, first we heard from the Washington Post that there were thousands of North Koreans in Ukraine training, and now there's a little bit more detail to suggest that there are 3,000 of them. They're training as a special battalion to be brought to bear against the Ukrainians in Kursk, and that wouldn't surprise me at all. Okay, moving on to geopolitical topics. We're going to start with Mark Rutte, the present, or the newly appointed General Secretary of NATO. Quote, Russia cannot intimidate NATO with threats, says NATO boss Mark Rutte. Our message to Putin is clear. We will continue, and we will do whatever it takes to ensure that he does not succeed and that Ukraine will win. Really strong rhetoric, which is exactly what we want to hear from Mark Rutte. He's got a tough job, hasn't he? NATO will do what's necessary to ensure Ukraine's victory. But there is this, people are still very scared, obviously, of the saber rattling that Putin often does, nuclear saber rattling, and that has affected the American response, I think, to the war in Ukraine to a great deal. And NATO is trying to navigate its way whilst Trump-proofing itself ahead of a potential Trump election, given that he would take America in the other direction. And meanwhile, the present administration is being beholden to the anti-escalation ideology of people like Jake Sullivan. It's going to be very interesting to see if Harris does win, what will be her response to the war and her positioning that will differentiate herself from Biden. And there's a lot of, I think most people tend to think that she'd be fairly similar, but she will make a marked difference in things like strikes. Mark Kelly's talked about that's a senator from Arizona, Democrat, who was, he was touted as being a possible vice presidential pick. He, as a former Navy airman and astronaut, said that he indicated that it could be to do with sort of striking deeper into Russia and so on and so forth. But, that's not going to be until after November anyway, and that's a whole other month to wait, while Ukraine are suffering and Russia just bringing in North Korea. And then it gets really I get downhearted when I read things like this. There's real war fatigue in the West regarding the war in Ukraine, particularly in terms of aid and support. And that's a quote from Finland's foreign minister, Elina Valtonen. So you've got people right on the edge of this war, your Baltics and your Nordic nations, and you've got foreign minister from Finland. Finland's super supporting Ukraine, but saying, there is a real fatigue. People are wanting to push Ukraine towards a peace deal. According to her, some Western officials have started privately discussing ways to achieve a ceasefire, despite the fact that the Russian army has occupied about a fifth of Ukraine's territory. And it just infuriates me. It makes me angry. It makes me so sad that, we are the ones that could have helped enough that Ukraine prevailed much quicker than it. Well, they've not prevailed, and they may not prevail. I don't think Russia will prevail. I think the likely outcome at the moment is some kind of stalemate where Ukraine lose territory to Russia. And that's so infuriating because it didn't need to be that way, and it doesn't need to be that way. Now, Czechia is getting a bit of a beating for taking a lot of Russian money in, and more money than they've given to Ukraine. Okay, Czechia, one of Ukraine's closest allies, has let oil refineries earn over €1 billion in surplus profits through discounted Russian fuel purchases, despite alternatives long being available. New research seen by Politico shows. Now, there is some pushback to this to suggest that, well, Czechia are just fulfilling contracts, and actually, you know, this. I am not quick to judge countries like this because just the reality of human nature. Individuals are going to make money. So if you are an export company, unfortunately, we're not all strong moral beacons, are we? And money does a lot of heavy lifting in explaining our behaviour. And unfortunately, that means that even though sanctions are in place, governments might put in this moral framework. We'll do as human beings our utmost to bypass that framework in order to make a quick buck. And that's why you see all these nations still exporting huge amounts instead of directly to Russia, doing it to Kyrgyzstan and Armenia and so on and so forth. So, yeah, there is that. But then there are also countries that would like to not buy Russian hydrocarbons, but they're either contracted into it on a long-term basis, or doing so would just cause massive inflation, which is politically incredibly unpopular. So it depends if there are elections nearby and so on and so forth. Germany has done a really good job of weaning themselves off Russian hydrocarbons, but part of that might have been to do with Nord Stream being not an option. So it certainly can be done, but yeah, Czechia getting a lot of hassle for this. As War Translator says, according to Politico, the Czech Republic has spent over €7 billion on Russian and oil gas, which is 5 times more than the €1.29 billion in aid the country has provided to Ukraine. The publication, citing a report by analysts from the Centre for the Study of Democracy, notes that in 2024, the Czech Republic's dependence on Russian oil stood at 50%, or it stands at the moment at 50%. However, analysts believe that the country has the potential to completely abandon Moscow's exports. It is suggested that the situation may be due to the fact that after Russia's full-scale invasion, the EU granted the Czech Republic an exception to the ban on Russian oil supplies for one reason or another. Right, says Cormac Smith, Russia is, I'd like to speak to actually. Russia, if you don't know him, so who is he? Former UK civil servant and advisor to the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, charity leader, media pundit, contributing editor to defencebrink.uk. Anyway, he says Russia is closer to collapse than we think. They lost 300,000 troops this year, all to take less land than Ukraine took in Kursk in a month, with 40% devoted to the war effort. Economy is contracting. Sorry, with 40% devoted to the war effort, the economy is contracting. This is the importance of commas, of course. Down 18% since 2013. It's time that the West put the boot in, not snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. I'd absolutely agree. But yeah, it is certainly a good time to turn the screw, and it's at exactly this time that the West seems to be distracted with Israel or elections or becoming fatigued, and actually Russia is arguably on the brink. Putin himself has submitted a draft to the Russian State Duma for the ratification of a comprehensive strategic partnership with, I wonder, North Korea and Russia between the two. State agency RAA reports deep concerns and condemnations by the West are expected, or indeed not. I think Russia are in deep trouble, and they are flailing and need as much help as they can get from anyone they can get that help from. And if that's North Korea, then that's North Korea. North Korea have actually joined the war in Ukraine, says Jürgen Naudit, who I think he writes, does he also write in newspapers occasionally? Jürgen Naudit. Anyway, German. North Korea actually joined the war in Ukraine. There was a report from the GUR and Zelensky that North Korea are in. Where are the reactions from the West? And I don't mean condemnation, actual actions. Well, the Iranian regime support to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is unacceptable and must stop, says Ursula von der Leyen. So this is good rhetoric from the EU, and they're keeping pressure on Iran. I therefore welcome the adoption of our sanctions against individuals and entities in response to Iran's drone and missile transfers to Russia. More is needed. That's really good news. That was yesterday from Ursula von der Leyen. You get the typical pro-Russian supporter here. Absolute nonsense. But yeah, good stuff there from von der Leyen. Flash News says Putin may attend the G20 summit in Brazil in November. He must be arrested there. So if he does, so that's the Prosecutor General Costin. Quote, I would like to emphasize once again that the Brazilian authorities, as a state party to the Rome Statute, are obliged to arrest him if he dares to come. The Prosecutor General emphasized. That is really interesting, and I hope that does happen. Let's just make sure that this Prosecutor General is Brazilian. Oh no, this is Andrei Kostin. No, unfortunately, that's just the Ukrainians saying that. Of course, it's Kostin. Yeah, so that's not going to make any difference, is it? You've got Brazil. Oh, I don't know where I was. Who knows? Here I was. So yeah, you've got a Ukrainian saying that Brazil should arrest Putin, but I'd be very surprised if Putin goes to Brazil and is arrested. There's probably a greater chance he won't go to Brazil at all, because the rest of the G20 nations will be putting a lot of pressure on him. I think that'd be highly controversial. Trump claims Putin talked to him about invading Ukraine, says the Daily Telegraph, stating that it didn't happen. Well, actually, Daily Telegraph didn't say this. Trump said it himself in one of his kind of sit-downs here, stating that it didn't happen earlier due to his strong stance. So, of course, it didn't happen because of him. And so on and so forth. That's always what he's going to say. He added that he would end the war before being re-elected, adding that he gets along, quote, very well with Putin. Of course you do. I mean, you have to get... Oh, it's going to be super rude then. I won't. Suffice to say, you'd have to get on well with him if you're going to be that close. Okay, so here we have an American in Ukraine just saying something. I'm just going to bring this up because this is someone that I come across an awful lot when I'm doing my American political videos. He is a source on Twitter that is massively in support of Donald Trump, but he's also just a Putin puppet as well. So this is a reminder that Nazi lover and Russian propagandist Gunter Eagleman, also known as David Freeman, was fired from his position as a Texas police officer, hasn't held a job in 3 years and continuously simps for Russia. His incompetency cost him his job with the Harker Heights police force, yet he has the gall to come on here and say people lack common sense. This is just screen grabbing a Gunter Eagleman, or aka David Freeman, former American policeman, saying, Dear Putin, I hope this post finds you well. I wanted to let you know the majority of Americans do not support the funding of Ukraine. We do, however, have a few that believe everything in the US government and the media tells them. We call them sheep. These sheep are incapable of thinking for themselves and lack any common sense. I ask, don't blame us for the sheep and their actions. Signed, Real Americans. Shut up, you absolute fool. Okay, Kiev Independent reports that pro-Kremlin lawmaker from Robert Fico's party, that's the Slovakian government coalition party Smer, so there are three parties in a coalition in Slovakia, and Robert Fico's Smer party, which has become increasingly populist and actually has moved further to the right. He has visited... So a lawmaker from that party has visited Moscow and apologised for EU policies. This is Slovakia undermining the EU very publicly and openly in the same way that Hungary's done. And honestly, there should be repercussions for this. That's like having a football team, right? And one of your players goes off to another team, an opposition team, right? And then sort of does a press conference with that team at their club, slagging off your club. You'd be like, dude, you're not playing for us anymore. Jog on. You don't do that. Lubos Blaha, senior lawmaker from Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico's pro-Russian Smer Direction party, visited Moscow on the 12th. He posted a 4-minute Telegram video walking across the Red Square in which he repeated common Kremlin propaganda points, praised Russia and called for an end to Western Russophobia. I get so frustrated. I get more frustrated at the people within the EU and the US who support, people like Gunter Eagleman, people like, that's why I'm so angry with Donald Trump, more so than I ever have been, and JD Vance. And these people Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene that repeat this stuff, it sickens me. It absolutely sickens me. The EU has imposed sanctions against the head of Gagauzia, the autonomous region of Moldova. So this is one of these areas. It's not Transnistria. It's another part of Moldova that the Russians are trying to cause a lot of discord in. And the EU has imposed some sanctions against its head. So we've seen her before a number of times. She is basically a Putin proxy. Several Moldovan pro-Russian politicians were also sanctioned for promoting separatism in the region, attempting to overthrow the constitutional order and threatening Moldova's sovereignty and independence. Moving on, in Germany, there's been a noted increase in Russian intelligence activity aimed at disrupting Western support for Ukraine, according to to DW. Now, this is a sign of the times. Like, we are back to a very hot version of the Cold War, where Russia is just doing things against us and, as a collective West. And we're kind of sort of sitting back and allowing them to do that and not, they're involved in a war against Ukraine. And we're still, like Germany, for example, saying, oh, right, you're screwing us over in terms of espionage and cyber attacks and spying and this and that. Oh, well, we're still not going to give Ukraine a Taurus, or we're still not going to lift restrictions on firing missiles deep into Russia. And I know Germany have done an amazing job, so I shouldn't really criticize Germany too much because they have really stepped up. But it's just frustrating that I think collectively in the West, we are just, I don't know, the most important times, we appear to be the most impotent. Minister Nancy Faeser stated that while the Kremlin's aggression is rising, Russian spy operations in Germany have weakened, however. So they're becoming more aggressive, more open, but their actual network has weakened due to expulsion of agents. Several months ago, attacks using explosives were thwarted, intending to hinder military aid to Ukraine. Well, actually, there's another story that's just come out in the last 24 hours that Russia attempted to blow up a German civilian aircraft earlier this year. The Russian terror plot failed because the package detonated prematurely, so it caught fire, I believe, before it was to be loaded onto the plane in Leipzig. So yeah, there you go. These activities, these aggressive activities from Russia appear to be increasing in frequency. Now, here we have a newspaper. I don't know where this came from. That's an archived version. Which newspaper is this? We'll have a look in a second. Anyway, Putin spies are plotting global chaos. Quote, what Putin is trying to do is hit us all over the place, argues Fiona Hill, who previously served in America's National Security Council. She compares the strategy to the film Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. That's in The Economist. So we have, again, building on what we just heard about Germany and the increase in kind of frequency and boldness of these attacks. You got Fiona Hill then saying that they're trying everything all at once, they're just going all out. And it's almost like it's the Russian death throes. I don't know if there's a sense of desperation. They're just like, it's all or nothing. We've got to do everything we can and force... we've got to do everything we can to get Trump in charge and then force negotiations. We get to keep a bunch of Ukraine and then we'll rebuild and come at it again. And we'll still have a chance of creating this Russian empire, this Ruski Mir. And I'll beat Peter the Great and so on and so forth. And that's exactly what we need to stop from happening. Anyway, that's enough from me babbling on. Thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate your support. Take care and I'll speak to you soon.